Let me announce that the film about Audrey, Queen of Hearts, if you haven't seen it, it's absolutely wonderful. It's going to be screened on August 13th at the East Hampton Library at 6 p.m. That's a Tuesday, 6 p.m. You don't need to make a reservation. It's a free event, but you can find out more and you can sign up online on their website. I was honored when April asked me to introduce this event, but of course saddened by the fact that Audrey can't do it herself as she had intended. Her memoir now stands as the final testament to her lifelong devotion to following her own path in spite of the considerable obstacles she describes in such detail. Her candor does her great credit, revealing a complex mixture of strength and vulnerability, or maybe it's pig-headed stubbornness, balanced by the doubts and insecurities that all artists face, but are often reluctant to admit. Audrey's frankness comes through so strongly, no soft peddling, no hedging, no glossing over, that at times she seems too eager to set the record straight. But who can blame her? She withstood so many setbacks on the road to recognition that she's entitled to rehash them in no uncertain terms. I heard some of her anecdotes firsthand, and it's interesting to see how she fleshed them out in print. What's fascinating to me about her account is how it shows her simultaneously as an insider and an outsider in the New York art world, going, as I said in my blurb, against the grain while coexisting with the great 20th century innovators, admiring their art even as she deplored their personal lives. She clearly did not want to be them, and for sure she wasn't. She carved out her own territory and occupied it with fierce determination, for which she has my sincere respect. I want to thank you all for giving voice to Audrey's words today, and I know that she would have relished this tribute. So I'm going to kick it off with the beginning section. It's told, the format is kind of a flashback format, where she goes in and out of this environment where she's sitting in the city on a park bench reflecting on her life. And this film comes as a recurring motif throughout the book. The Buddhas of 83rd Street. It was the last day of September 1983 and a chill was in the air. I jumped out of bed, pulled on my sweatshirt and jeans, and headed for the studio. Skull and Roses, my latest painting, was waiting half-finished on the easel. I mixed a color. It was cadmium red blended with burnt orange. I loaded my brush with a thick, creamy pigment, but I couldn't apply it to the canvas. I simply couldn't paint. I tried again and again until my arms tensed and ached from sheer frustration, and then my fingers began to cramp. The episode was so upsetting that I left the studio and headed for Broadway, where I sat on a bench and wasted away the hours thinking about this bombshell of a painting block that had hit me. I listened to the rumbling motors and honking horns of the Upper West Side delivery trucks and buses, silently watching the neighborhood residents shopping, pushing baby carriages, and going about their business. Sprawled on nearby benches were mentally ill patients from the 85th Street shelter, addicts slumped over in stupors of drugged dreams, and neighborhood alcoholics who swigged from bottles wrapped in brown paper bags as if the bag would conceal its contents. At first, I thought it was just a phase, a temporary block. I'd had them before when I was younger. They usually lasted a couple of days and rapidly dissipated. I could easily get back to work, and sometimes I even felt refreshed. But now I was 52, and this one was different. It was as if a sheet of steel had dropped between the canvas and me, like Richard Serra's sculpture Tilted Art, solid and impenetrable. I went to bed that first night, safe in my husband's arms, and woke up when the sun came shining through my bedroom window. I wasn't sure that I'd even fallen asleep. I slipped on my jeans, sneakers, and a sweatshirt, ready to confront the canvas again, hoping things had changed. But the block appeared before me with increased intensity. I froze in front of the easel. My body stiffened, my hands trembled, and I had to get out. I bolted from the studio and headed for Broadway. It was a brisk morning, and the few remaining leaves blew about me as I made my way up 83rd Street. Someone had already occupied my bench. He was a nervous wreck who stared at me suspiciously. He hadn't bathed or shaved in weeks, but I could read beneath the stubble and grime that he was young, sadly only in his 20s. His leg vibrated up and down like a seismic tremor, shaking his loose pants, red shirt, and rumpled plaid jacket. I nodded to him as I sat down, but he shot me a wide-eyed, terror-filled look. I understood. He didn't frighten me. He was most likely schizophrenic. He fired a quick glance at my paint-spattered jeans and decided I belonged. We sat there silently, staring at nothing, the Buddhas of 83rd Street. Oh, I was right on time.
Thank you. Helen, thank you also for being here so much. You're such an important part of this community. Anyway, someone had already occupied my bench. He was a nervous, oops, that's right. Sorry. Being a New Yorker and sketching in parks, restaurants, and back alleys, I had observed over the years that people with schizophrenia like to dress in vivid colors. They put together crazy outfits, print scarves, hats, beads, pins, anything with a lot of energy to keep up with the high voltage electricity in their brains. They reminded me of my mother. She was not schizophrenic, just a larger-than-life gambling addict who liked to wear beaded sweaters with rhinestone brooches. She sewed lace collars onto print blouses and adorned herself with pearl necklaces. She either tucked her hair into a sequined jet black snood or wore fanciful hats draped with a netted veil and embellished with peacock feathers or clusters of artificial flowers. Her hats were worn tilted to one side, and in spite of her extravagant taste for ornamentation, she exuded an air of elegance. Another week passed, and still I couldn't paint. The block had clamped its venomous incisors into my neck and paralyzed me. To make matters worse, I was under pressure. Time was running out. I had a show scheduled to open in November at the Louis K. Mizell Gallery in Soho. The gallery had already placed the ads, collectors and museums had been notified, and articles were being written. Along with Chuck Close, Richard Estes, and Robert Bechtel, I was a photorealist at the peak of my career, and I was the only woman in this groundbreaking group of artists who were to have a profound effect on art history. My work was in collections of major museums throughout the United States and Europe, and colleges and universities were inviting me to lecture. But since the painting block hit, I wanted no part of it. I refused all invitations, withdrew from friends, stayed away from art openings. All I could do was sit on the bench, immobilized in a state of depression, verging on despair. Art was my vehicle, yet in spite of the years of study and hard work, my world had collapsed. I was reduced to a semi-hypnotic state, with my mind wandering back and forth in time. It was 5 o'clock, and the sun was setting when I felt something irritating my throat. I cleared it a few times, but it got worse. I began to cough, sputter, and then choke. The exhaust pipe of the stalled bus was belching out black, toxic fumes, its foul smoke enveloping the whole center island. I doubled over, my throat constricted, and tears flooded from my eyes. Backed up cars honked their horns and my lungs hurt. I couldn't breathe. There was a scramble, and everyone on the benches scattered in all directions, looking for fresh air. I staggered out of the fog and coughed my way home. Days later, back on the bench, I closed my eyes to the bright sun. My thoughts zigzagged back to the time when I was 13, when I unequivocally just concluded that life was not worth living without art. Yet here I was, 40 years later, stranded on the Broadway bench without the very thing that held me together. I felt depressed, disillusioned, disconnected, dazed, and derelict, all D's, just like my report card grades.
I woke up the next morning not wanting to return to the Broadway island of smoke, isolation, and exile. But the idea of facing my unfinished canvas was even more upsetting. So I bypassed the studio and headed for Broadway, where my usual spot was waiting. The bus and its offending fumes were long gone. The air was clean, and it was a pleasant day. I made myself comfortable and settled in for the long haul. What had brought me to this point of desolation? How did it all begin? Even as a young girl in primary school, I had wanted to become an artist, to learn art's rules, study its techniques, but I had no idea how to do it or where to go. Fortunately, one day in early 1945, I bumped into Flora, a girl who lived in my building. Flora received private lessons after school and kept apart for neighborhood children, but just this once, Flora stopped and offhandedly mentioned that she was taking the test for a high school that specialized in art. Overcome with excitement, I bombarded her with questions. She was reluctant to offer details, but eventually revealed the name. It was the High School of Music and Art on 135th Street in Harlem, and you needed to take an entrance exam and bring a portfolio. From that moment on, I became obsessed and thought of nothing but getting into this school where I could learn the craft of art. I was also worried and perplexed because I didn't know what a portfolio was. I asked my mother. She knew nothing and wasn't particularly interested in finding out. However, Mom was more than willing to let me pursue my ideas so she could carry on with her gambling addiction. Ironically, my mother had strong artistic abilities, yet failed to value them in herself or me. She embroidered tablecloths, crocheted blankets, designed her own needlepoint pillows, and set up carefully arranged flowers. She cut reproductions of old master paintings from magazines and placed them all over the apartment. A Rembrandt self-portrait hung over the green velour sofa in the living room. He wore an oversized beret and pleated smock. That's when I realized that artists worked in specific outfits.
Just so you don't lose your place. Rembrandt hung next to a 15th century Italian artist named Ghirlandaio, I hope I got that right, who painted a beautiful young boy looking up at an old man whose nose was grotesque, bulbous, swollen and infested with hideous warts. It hurt just to look at him. I knew the boy loved the old man in spite of his deformity because of the beautiful expression on his face. And I also knew the painting was great in spite of its subject matter. But I couldn't understand why my mother liked it. She gravitated toward the strange and unbalanced and sought out disturbing images. Her tastes ranged from kitsch to the most profound expression of high art. Right next to the Ghirlandaio was Jan van Eyck's 1434 Arnolfini portrait. People in these paintings became my friends. They inhabited the house and kept me company when I was home alone. They looked after me as I glanced down from the living room wall. Rembrandt was the grandfather I never had. Mary Cassatt, my good aunt, Paul Cézanne, my steadfast uncle, Amedeo Modigliani, my wayward brother. Art itself took on the role of substitute mother and family. Not only did it invigorate me, but it also protected me from the confusion of the outside world. The concept of art took over my life. The history of art became my history, the making of art my truth, and the essence of art my religion. Centered over the piano was a romantic print of a violinist flinging his instrument in the air in order to kiss his beautiful young accompanist. In the bathroom, a sexy Alberto Vargas pinup girl with bulging double-D breasts, nipples popping out of her tight white blouse hung over the towel rack. Vargas was an illustrator for Esquire and Playboy magazines and one of the first artists to use the airbrush. The airbrush was considered a mechanical device used only by lowly retouchers and illustrators for their slick commercial work. In spite of Artis's subject matter, his technique intrigued me and filtered into my decision to go against art world doctrine and experiment with the airbrush years later. Chuck Close and I were to legitimize the use of the airbrush in fine art painting. I found myself attracted to images of passion, sorrow, love, anguish, joy, and inner truth. Artists concretize these emotions and freeze them on the canvas. It's one of the miraculous offerings of art. Besides the drawing test to be given at the school, I had 2 weeks to create 10 works for my portfolio. I pulled out a few sheets of erasable bond typewriter paper and 2 yellow Mongol pencils from the family desk in the foyer. In those days, pencil sharpeners had to be screwed to the desk and rotated by hand. Only schools or offices had them, so I used my father's single-edged razor blade to sharpen my stubby pencil tips. I searched the apartment for subject matter and found a bottle of Old Granddad whiskey stashed under the kitchen sink. Old Granddad's craggy face with his round, wire-rimmed glasses and deeply etched age lines reminded me of the old men I hung out with in the park. I liked old men. From as early as 5 or 6, I sat on their laps and watched them play chess and checkers. I was alone most of the time because of my mother's gambling addiction. These men were like parents to me. Besides, unlike the cliquey girls, they accepted me and tolerated my mood swings. Looking back on it now, I was lucky none of them were perverts.
Old Granddad gave me my first drawing. I set to work on our white enamel kitchen table, proceeding to render every hair on old. Okay. I proceeded to render every hair on old Granddad's head. Then I spit on my fingers and smeared the graphite to achieve dramatic chiaroscuro effects. I thought it was terrific. I didn't know any better. Using a picture in the Daily News advertising Mrs. Miniver, a movie about World War II, I drew a portrait of the British actress Leah Arson. The reproduction was so blurry I had to refocus her face in my drawing. That presage was to come years later in my photorealistic painting of Marilyn Monroe. My next drawing was a cartoon of 2 girls walking, taken from an illustration inside a Kotex box. The last few sketches were of the old men playing chess, the horse chestnut trees I love so much, and the pigeons pecking away on the cobblestones. That was it. My 10 drawings were done. It was time to get a portfolio to put them in. I asked my father where could I find one, but he had never been to an art supply store and wasn't even sure what a portfolio looked like. My brother Milton might have known, but he was away in college, about to be shipped off to war. My mother said, ask at the local 5 and 10 cent store. Woolworths has everything. Getting to Woolworths on 181st Street was a long and potentially dangerous walk, because I had to cross Broadway and enter Amsterdam territory, where the Irish dukes beat up the Jewish kids. We were secular Jews who only observed major Jewish holidays like Yom Kippur and Passover. But it didn't matter if you were religious or not. You were likely to be verbally abused or physically attacked. But I needed that portfolio. I half ran, half walked, never looking back until I found Woolworths, all lit up with its red and gold sign above the entrance. I pushed open the swinging doors and asked the first sales girl I saw, where can I find a portfolio? A what? A portfolio, to put things in. The girl chewed her gum and shook her head. Never heard of it. I moved to the next aisle and asked again, do you know where I can find a portfolio? Nobody knew what I was talking about, so I decided to fiddle with a basket of lipsticks at the cosmetic counter. I pulled off the caps and tested the colors on the heel of my thumb. The cosmetic salesgirl stood there, chewing her gum, oblivious.
She looked up. Yeah, take a look at the stationery counter over there. Made my way to the next aisle with stacks of loose leaf binders, steno pads, paper clips, erasers, rubber bands, and other assorted paraphernalia were bunched together in little cubicles. And there it was, a small brown leatherette folder with the word portfolio in both on diagonally across the front in shiny gold script. Wow, I am lucky, I thought. The only thing that puzzled me was the writing paper and envelopes inside. I paid the sales girl with my allowance money and headed home.
By Peter Cooper's visionary building. Built out of huge blocks of brownish purple stone, it looked like a mysterious temple crowned with a row of giant pointed skylights. For me, Cooper Union seemed to dominate the entire Lower East Side of Manhattan, like a giant monolith. At the stroke of 9, the oversized metal doors swung open and hundreds of anxious students rushed in to secure seats. I spotted Margie and waved, but we got separated. The tests were designed to determine intellectual and artistic abilities and took 2 days to administer. Every 20 minutes, a new booklet was handed out. We had to complete as many pages as possible before the next one was distributed. Cooper Union would select 90 students out of 3,000 candidates. Only 45 of us would graduate. The thrill of being one of the graduates is difficult to explain.
I was 17 years old and a student in one of the greatest art schools in the country. Avant-garde artists taught there and worked in the surrounding studios. There were serious professionals like Peter Busa, Steve Wheeler, and Will Barnett, who formed the Indian space painting movement, Charles Guathmy, a star of the social realist group, and Nick Marcigano and John Farron, who were part of the hot new abstract expressionist movement. These artists were producing some of the most radical and shocking art forms of the century. Abstract expressionism was electrifying the city, revolutionizing the art world and riveting the public. It would be historically and socially epic. Jackson Pollock, Elaine de Kooning, and Franz Klein were to become legends. And here I was, a young, aspiring artist, miraculously scooped up by this whirling tornado and deposited in the center of one of the most exciting periods of all of art history. Because Cooper Union was free, it didn't have dormitories, cafeterias, bookstores, or lounges. Students lived at home with their parents and commuted back and forth on buses and trains every day. A few slept in a rented loft in the neighborhood. After my first semester, with money from odd jobs and an occasional sale of a drawing or watercolor, I was able to rent a cheap loft in a condemned building on 8th Street, right alongside 3rd Avenue elevated subway. It was legal and considered too dangerous to inhabit, but I knew that I could get around the tilted staircases, broken banisters, and the wet rot that weakened the floors. I was thrilled to have a studio of my own. John Grillo, a handsome, talented abstract expressionist painter, rented the top floor. Bob Linder, a comic book illustrator who inked Spider-Man, rented the first floor, and my studio was in the middle. I could watch Linder work from a sinkhole in the center of my loft, and when he needed some extra help to meet deadlines, I helped ink Spider-Man for him. My studio was directly across the street from Cooper Union, its second floor windows on the same level as the elevated train tracks. The tracks were supported by powerful steel T-beams that had become so encrusted with rust over the years that the chunks of orange-colored crumbling metal chipped off and stained your fingers and jeans if you accidentally brushed against them. The overhead railroad ties cast light shadows on the streets below and spread a dull pall over the neighborhood. Everything was sooty black and gray, except for the door to my condemned building, which the previous tenant had painted bright cadmium red. It was the only upbeat color in that godforsaken Bowery. Like a Jasper Johns Target painting, it sucked in color and breathed out energy. I was living in the center of the action, looking out at the eye of the bull. The local trains rattled into Astor Place Station every 5 minutes, blowing a storm of cigarette butts, crumpled newspapers, paper cups, and threadbare rags. The winos who took shelter under the tracks slept in makeshift tents, oblivious to the ear-splitting, high-pitched shrieks of the metal wheels as the local train screeched into the station. Most of the time, I worked with cotton stuffed in my ears. The screech was muted when the express train was passed, but the reverberations from its accelerated speed shook the building, rattled my windows, and buzzed my feet as if they were plugged into an electrical socket. The art world was open to me, but so were the pitfalls of abstract expressionist life. It was exhilarating, but also rough and fast.
Chapter 2, the New York art scene, 1949 to 1959. The Bowery and the Cedar Bar. A restlessness often swept across me on the bench on Broadway. What would break this spell of immobility? I escaped to the past, which was not always comforting or reassuring, but it did remind me that I once had been an artist. In these flashbacks, I often found myself at the Cedar Bar or in the Bowery. Its sounds, smells, and memories never left me. Life was exhilarating, unpredictable, and volatile from the moment I woke up in my chilly studio until the wee hours of the morning when I said goodbye to the few stragglers who remained at the Cedar Bar until closing time. It was romantic, it was glamorous, and I was young and eager to be part of the scene, creating art that pushed the limits to the breaking point. The Bowery gained fame for being a gathering place for hundreds of homeless derelicts and alcoholics who wanted nothing more than to find their next bottle of rot gut. There was little to no help or hope for them, except for a nearby Salvation Army station. These men hitched rides on boxcars or walked hundreds of miles from all over the country because the word was out that they could live on the streets and the police wouldn't bother them. One or two of the flop houses offered these poor men a bed to rent for a few pennies, but the majority of them slept, pissed, and shat in the streets. Some decrepit bodies were nearly always passed out in a doorway. I had to push them aside just to get through the front door and then quickly shove them back out before they fell into my hallway. Ironically, it was the staggering alcoholics who lent a steady stability to the area, because they could always be found in their favorite spots, setting up their makeshift beds and sipping their putrid concoctions. More disruptive were the abstract expressionists, flocking there in droves, invigorating the area with excitement and energy. This new American movement was gathering force with each speed that artists from all over the country and as far away as Europe felt its magnetic pull. Artists packed up their canvases, left their homes, and resettled in studios on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Paris was over. New York City was rapidly becoming the international hub of art activity. Max Ernst and Marcel Duchamp flew in from France, and Piet Mondrian from Holland. Elaine de Kooning, also from Holland, stowed away on a ship. Jackson Pollock rode a bus from the prairies of the Midwest. Franz Klein took a train from the coal mines and steel mills of Pennsylvania. They brought a storm of activity and eye-opening ideas to our small area of the Lower East Side.
Artists rented raw, rough, barn-like studios with few amenities on 8th, 9th, and 10th Street. There was no heat. Toilets were in the outside hallway and shared by several tenants. Life felt open, dangerous, and free, completely American, not like the elegantly carpeted, luxurious ateliers of 19th century European artists. Younger artists, sensing the energy arrive, rented studios and gathered around older mentors, generating concentric rings of artistic energy. Artists were everywhere. Just walking along the street, you could hear them discussing their latest work. We all knew one another, and even if we didn't know someone's name, the familiar face was acknowledged and accepted just from being around. Everyone needed to talk. Ideas were spilling onto the canvas so fast that artists began to congregate, exchanging information about galleries and dealers at the Cedar Bar, drinking, coughing, and sharing ideas at the Waldorf Cafeteria on 8th Street, buying art supplies at Lou Rosenthal's basement store around the corner. Lou knew all the artists and cared about them. If there was a specific color I wanted, he would slip it to me if I didn't have enough money. Landis Lewiton's career never took off, but he was a valued member of the community. He could be found most afternoons sitting in the Waldorf cafeteria, bent over a cup of coffee, with his sketchbook open beside him, engaged in heated discussions about art with Aristodemus Kaldis, a tall, imposing Greek who was never seen without his red scarf tossed over one shoulder. I would peer through the plate glass windows, hoping to spot those two philosophers so I could listen to them pontificate. The Waldorf was a stripped-down, shabby cafeteria with lighting so grim the people inside looked embalmed. But it was a good place to get out of the cold, and we could sit there for hours over a Parker horse roll and a hot cup of coffee. When we were short on money, we made meals out of hot water and ketchup. Jack Kerouac and some of the other beat poets hung out there, and Franz Klein and Bill de Kooning would saunter in and join us after they finished painting. They were the respected masters, the heroes, and I was the young woman artist. Somehow I had managed to position myself as part of the new AbX movement and not just another young woman to fuck. These men accepted me, and I was thrilled to be in their presence, listen in, and take part in their conversation. The Waldorf was depressingly lit, and the Cedar Bar was too noisy for any serious discussion, so a group of artists got together and formed a social club. We simply referred to it as the Artist Club, and it was exclusively for hardcore abstract expressionists. Poets, writers, and musicians were also invited. It was not open to the public. Only members or invited guests were allowed in. The club met on Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday nights and was run by the sculptor Philip Pavia, who collected the dues and offered free syrupy black coffee he brewed in a huge aluminum urn. At first, the club moved to wherever Pavia could rent a cheap loft, but in 1948, he found a permanent meeting place at 39 East 8th Street. Nick Marascono, my teacher at Cooper, was one of the 10 charter members. He brought me as his guest, but it was more like a date. I felt special. That's how I first met Bill, Franz, and Jackson. I remember watching them toss down tumblers of scotch, chased by swigs of beer. I was an awestruck, thrilled 18-year-old, and they were my heroes, as much as Rembrandt, Tintoretto, and Picasso were. Friday nights were special because of panel discussions where critics and artists were invited to present their ideas. Fevered debates broke out, and it was not unusual for disagreements to turn into shouting matches. One evening, a woman on the panel surprised the audience by wearing a white kabuki mask and not saying a word throughout the presentation. Urged to take it off, she removed it, only to reveal another one underneath. When she finally exposed her naked face, it was the strikingly beautiful Marisol. She had turned the evening into a performance piece. I wonder why Marisol was on the panel in the first place. She rarely spoke, with her barely audible high-pitched voice. I soon learned that despite being the same age as I, she was already having an affair with de Kooning, who was in his late 50s. Mariscano resembled Michelangelo's marble statue of Lorenzo de Medici. His handsome oval face and just crosses on art were mesmerizing, and every girl in class had a crush on him. For a brief period, I shared his rickety studio at 12 West 12th Street in the heart of the meatpacking district. It was a dangerous and desolate area in those days. Derelicts lay around in cardboard boxes, urinated in the street, and set gasoline drums on fire to warm their chilled bodies. Mariscano's wooden studio building was a tinderbox that could easily have gone up in flames, but the rent was cheap and the space ample. We worked in separate rooms, but I could see that Mariscano was breaking away from abstract expressionism and experimenting with figuration.
Sounds great. Doing good. Okay, pose for me, he said. And I did. The studio was deadly quiet, the streets were empty. The bleak meatpacking district came alive in the wee hours of the morning. The only thing moving besides a stray cat was Nick's arm, swishing his sable brush in a jar of liquefied black pigment, thinned to the consistency of light sweet cream. We were engulfed in an eerie, magical quietude. Nick painted me with rapid, spontaneous brushstrokes executed in the style of a Zen calligrapher. He worked with passion and intensity. Moving in to take a closer look, he whispered, "I love the pout of your lower lip." He ran his fingers over my profile and kissed me a sweet, gentle, tender kiss, and then returned to work. One after another, he ripped sketches off the page, completing 10 or more before taking a break. Nick was also breaking away from his wife. People called her a witch. Merle Marsicano was an intimidating figure in the style of Lee Krasner. Merle was a modern dancer known for her firm, taut body and severe angular dance style. Her face was pockmarked, her mouth a turned-down slit, her eyes mean. Merle was a featured artist in several John Cage concerts that were held in shabby, dimly lit rooms. We took it all very seriously as we silently filed in. We sat on wooden folding chairs and waited until a plunk, thud, or mysterious rattling sound emerged from a prepared piano. Sometimes a silent interval would last for 15 minutes. We obediently waited for the next sound to emerge from God knows where and sound like God knows what. It seemed to me that those isolated sounds were the equivalent of solitary marks on the canvas. On special occasions, Merle appeared on stage and performed stiff, jerky, avant-garde dance moves to accompany this spasmodic music. Dressed in layers of transparent veils, she moved barefoot and grim-faced across the barren stage illuminated by a wash of blue light. Nick began to call me at home, sometimes 4 or 5 times in a row. "Marry me," Nick proposed the day after graduation. I was shocked. He never hinted at the seriousness of his feelings or discussed his marriage. He was gentleman enough to wait until I graduated, but I was nowhere near ready for marriage. Besides, being 2 generations older, he was part of a social world that scared the hell out of me. I distanced myself. Nick never left Merle, and we remained friends. It was the first time I had caught a glimpse of how vulnerable these godlike men were. In those days, we respected our teachers, our masters. Years later, Grace Hartigan complained to me, "Audrey, we used to wonder about what we could do for our teachers. Now our students want to know what we can do for them." The time at the club was alive with heated intellectual debates, liquor, black coffee, flirting, and sex. Avant-garde music, poetry, and dance were an important part of the scene. I mingled and interacted with John Cage, Merce Cunningham, John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, Frank O'Hara, and Morton Feldman, an ultramodern composer gaining notoriety. Mort understood the scene and commented, "What really matters is to have someone like Frank O'Hara standing behind you. Without that, your life is not worth a damn."
I was intrigued by his music and thought process until he once made a move on me. Mort wrapped his enormous arms around me and began to plant kisses on my lips and cheeks and neck. I tried to push him away, but he was beefy, overweight, and he overpowered me. So I jammed my elbow into his belly and shoved. He stumbled backward and fell, injuring his elbow. Mort righted himself and left in a fury. The following week, Mort appeared at the club with his arm in a sling. I felt bad and apologized, but we never spoke again. The entire area felt like a wild West Boom town, with people stumbling out of saloons, wandering aimlessly along the streets amid macho workmen wearing gunslinger-style tool belts. All this was interspersed with artists leaving their studios in their working outfits. You could see Bill de Kooning walking along wearing his white house painter overalls and matching cap, or Jackson Pollock in his paint-stained denim jeans, black t-shirt, and workman's boots. The streets were 95% male, with very few women populating them. I was wary about going out at night. Jackson Pollock. Memories of the evenings I spent talking art and flirting at the Cedar Bar brought a smile to my otherwise morose face as I sat on the bench. The young man nearby noticed my bemused look and smiled back. His was minuscule, just a small upward curl at each corner of his mouth. Still, I was happy to see his spirits lifted. I tucked my red shirt into my jeans and stretched out my legs. I could wear that bright color now, but I never wore color when I painted. It interfered. I wore denim jeans, a black sweatshirt, no lipstick, no makeup. My hair had to be pinned back, and even my underwear couldn't have any color. No ego, nothing to get in the way of clear vision. As I sat on the hard wooden slats, I saw myself back in the barren loft from so many years ago, getting ready for the night that was to change my life. As the light grew dim, I cleaned my brushes, used the turpentine-soaked rag to scrub the paint off my hands, and walked over to the Cedar Bar on 8th Street and University Place. But before I left, I spread my creamy geranium red lipstick over my lips, smacked them together, and tinted my cheeks with rouge. I unpinned my hair and let it fall to my shoulders, leaving a few loose strands dangling seductively over one eye. Veronica Lake style. I fastened the clasp of my turquoise and silver necklace and headed for the thrill and action of the bar. Being pretty mattered. Comments about women's looks were brazen and disparaging. Poor Krasner was considered ugly, and even though she had a great body, her face was the butt of nasty jokes. Elaine de Kooning said that if she were to sit on his lap, he would spread his legs and let her fall on her ass. Everyone laughed. After being alone all day, he felt a need to socialize, flirt, rub up against another body, and talk about art. Conversations vacillated between the old masters and modernism, between the Mondrian show at the Sydney Janus Gallery or de Kooning at Eton. Artists formed small groups and gossiped about dealers and galleries, which ones were drunks, which ones didn't pay their artists, which ones were approachable, and which co-op galleries were offering exhibition opportunities. Thanks.
Openings were held on Tuesday evenings, and the word spread about which galleries were serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Co-ops had little food to offer, but the Madison Avenue venues came alive with bands of artists stopping traffic as they zigzagged from gallery to gallery, filling their stomachs with assorted cheeses, crackers, cashew nuts, and white wine. At the Cedar Bar, passions ran so high about the aesthetics of art that arguments broke out. Was Greek art superior to Roman art? Was Cézanne better than Delacroix? Was Courbet better than Corot? Shoving, pushing, even occasional fistfights erupted. Reckless sex, heavy drinking, and drugs were part of the scene. Artists considered it essential for the vitality of their work. Grace Hartigan told me she couldn't paint without the Sturm und Drang of lovers and whiskey. I was always on guard at the Cedar Bar. A sense of danger hung in the air, particularly for a woman alone. Young artists, excited seekers, groupies would sip beer, scan the room, hoping to get a look at the big honchos. Seeing Jackson Pollock, Elaine de Kooning, Franz Klein leaning over the bar at the same time was like hitting the jackpot on a slot machine. 3 wild cards lined up in a row, each of them tossing down shots of scotch with beer chasers. Saturday nights were standing room only. Artists in denim shirts, paint-stained jeans were jammed together drinking beer, talking art. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, cast a yellow haze over the bar. All the tables and booths were filled with art world denizens on dates or conducting gallery business. The noise of bar talk and laughter was punctuated by the clinks of beer bottles and shot glasses. Occasionally, arguments broke out. A hush took over as heads turned toward the source, anticipating a fist fight. Most of the artists drank heavily, and some dabbled in drugs. You never knew what they might do. I remember spotting Mike Goldberg and Larry Rivers sitting in a front booth with 2 women squeezed next to them, puffing on Camel cigarettes, laughing and making a lot of noise. Empty beer bottles, shot glasses, and cigarette butts littered the table. I didn't know at the time that Larry was also shooting heroin, nor did I know what a strange and violent man Mike was.
Mike beckoned me over. He shoved one woman aside and patted the seat next to him. "Sit down," he said, with a coy smile. Mike was extremely handsome, and the look he gave me was sexy and alluring. I was attracted to him and felt a stir in my lungs. But the beer bottles and the raucous behavior made me very worried. I stopped and chatted for a moment, but decided not to accept his offer, even though this was a sought-after group. Being part of it would have given me entry into the in world. But I smiled and said, "No thanks, Mike," and headed toward the back, where it was quieter. My instincts were right. Mike was having an affair with Joan Mitchell. He smacked her around, beat her up, and later broke someone's kneecaps. He was jailed and spent time in a mental institution where Joan was raped by an attendant while visiting him. That sort of extremism was frightening and out of my realm of experience. I ordered a glass of wine and sat down at a round table opposite the far end of the bar. I had taken a few sips when Jackson Pollock strode in. I could tell he was there because a hush took over the place. You could hear the whispers, see the glances, and the fingers pointing. Everyone knew we were in the presence of someone great. Pollock was the most important artist in town, and to be near him, to overhear his conversation, or to talk with him directly was like being in the presence of a god. Acting the macho drunken artist was fashionable, and Pollock played the part perfectly, insulting rich collectors and offending art world potentates. At one of Peggy Guggenheim's parties, he unzipped his fly and pissed in her fireplace in front of an influential crowd. To defy wealth and power made him an art world hero, and I believed every bit of the myth attached to him. But it was also frightening to be around Pollock. He had an impulse disorder. One moment he could be talking normally, and the very next second he'd flip over a table or throw a cup of coffee in your face. People knew it. They felt the fear, but few talked openly about it, except for Jimmy Ernst, son of Max Ernst, years later when I visited him in East Hampton. Jimmy wanted to sell his old Victorian East Hampton home and move around the corner. It was 1971. And I had recently remarried and was selling my work, and my husband Bob was doing well, so we could afford a house. Besides, East Hampton prices were not what they were today. Jimmy cordially showed us the various rooms, but left the studio for last. I love the golden section proportions of the house, but the minute I set foot in his amazing studio, I knew I could work there. Jimmy knew I would use his studio well, and he wanted me to have it. We bought the house that weekend. Jimmy was creating black paintings and needed the dark, but I needed the light. I enlarged the studio, installed skylights, lowered the windows, which reminded me of those in my father's factory, and allowed the light to flood in.
Even though
Jimmy was part of the abstract expressionist group, prominently sitting amid them in the famous Life magazine irascible group portrait, he was a family man, married to one woman, Dallas, and the father of 2 children, Eric and Amy. This sort of stability was unusual among the ab-ex painters. Jimmy ushered us into the living room. Seated in white wicker chairs, we sipped hot coffee and reminisced about the Cedar Bar. Jimmy admitted that he had been afraid of Jackson, and I quickly said I felt the same way, that I always thought it was because I was a woman. But here was a man who felt it too. I noticed Jimmy's hand shaking each time he took a sip of coffee. He couldn't be nervous not around me. Only after we left did I realize the soft-spoken, gentlemanly Jimmy Ernst, like so many, had the DTs. Jackson and I occasionally met and talked at the Artist Club. I kept my distance because of the danger signals his very presence admitted, but I loved his work, and here I was sitting alone at a table with the great Jackson Pollock, only 6 feet away. He sat on a bar stool with his elbow bent against the bar, his hand cupped his forehead, holding up his large and heavy head. The heel of his shoe dug in the foot rail as he tossed down one tumbler of scotch after another. I genuinely wanted to talk to him, to ask questions about his techniques, his philosophy, his life, about old masters he liked, and what he thought of Bill de Kooning and Franz Klein. When he finally looked up, he stared like an animal. His scorching eyes forced me to look away. He was too overwhelming. I felt high with fear and anticipation. I was young and not yet toughened by life. We had come across each other before, but this was different. Something intense was happening, something personal. Jackson's art influenced me just as it did others, but I never wanted to imitate him. His sense of freedom, his break with the traditional systems intrigued me. He refused to be tied down. He cut the cord and moved headlong into uncharted territory. You didn't just look at his paintings, you walked into them. You felt the ground, you left the ground and entered a new universe. Jackson set his empty tumbler on the bar and headed towards me, zigzagging, staggering. A 5-day stubble covered his cheeks. Jackson set his empty tumbler on the bar and headed toward me, zigging, zagging, staggering. A 5-day stubble covered his cheeks. He reminded me of a porcupine shooting out prickly quills to protect himself. He was only 43 years old, but he looked puffy and waterlogged. His shiny nose bristled with tiny broken red capillaries. He hung over me, unsteady and wavering. He pressed his face close to mine, then pulled back, moving back and forth like a zoomed-in camera lens, trying to come into focus. Finally, he fell sideways into the seat next to me.
Where did you end? Oh, here it is. We talked about the latest show at the Janus Gallery and pondered whether to order a hamburger or a ham sandwich from a limited menu. During periods of silence, we just looked, scanned, and searched each other's faces. Jackson's eyes seemed to burn in their sockets. They could set you on fire and hold you in place. We were artists. Visual was more important than the verbal. I was aware of nothing else as Pollock let his guard down. He was taking a chance, casting aside the bravado of his public persona. Maybe he saw something young, not yet spoiled or sordid in me. Maybe he thought I could help him. He'd had enough of art talk, galleries, collectors, and critics. His soul needed mending. I imagine that his hopes were awakened, thinking he may have found a person to share the desperate state of his being. I asked him about his work. I wanted to talk art, but Jackson was anxious. He needed a fix. He needed instant contact. So he leaned over and tried to kiss me. I quickly turned away and felt his stubbly beard scratch my cheek. I knew he was married. I wondered where Lee was and what the hell he was doing. He put his lips close to my ear and whispered, "How about a fuck? Let's fuck." He was out of control and belched. That embarrassed him, so he grabbed my thigh and tried to pinch my buttocks. Was he using machismo to cover up his pain and fear? He was in bad shape. I felt a profound connection with him. He was a great artist, someone I revered. I wanted so much to help him, but the thought of kissing him revolted me. I couldn't do it. I put my hand on his arm and rested it there. We continued sitting together, sometimes talking, sometimes just being quiet. I took another look at Jackson's ravaged face and knew I no longer wanted to be a part of the scene. So much for the myth. I felt his pain, I still do. He tried again. "Let's go to your place and fuck." I shook my head no. "Then come home with me." "No thanks, Jackson, it's time for me to go." How could I have known that this hero I worshipped was having a nervous breakdown? I wanted to believe the myth of power, strength, and masculine authority. How could I have known as a young girl sitting at the table with him that he was completely incapable of making love? Anyone that drunk, whose hands, feet, and face were swollen and alcohol logged, would be incapable of any sexual act, and he must have known it too, but the image had to be preserved. Everyone believed it and tore him apart. It tore him apart. I didn't want my hero toppled from his pedestal, but sitting in front of me was a broken man, a man who covered his insecurities behind a drunken, brawling, belligerent persona that appeared to be defiantly strong.
Lee. Jackson Pollock was suicidal and disturbed long before he became an artist. What Jackson really needed was to be taken care of, soothed, cradled, and mothered. Instead, he was marketed and promoted as the big bad boy genius of 20th century art. He was no longer a person, but a commodity, a legend. The glamorous myth of the suffering male genius had to be demystified. As a child, Jackson couldn't compete with his alpha male brothers. They dated, had girlfriends, and eventually married, while Jackson found a rather odd pianist whom he courted for 1 year and only kissed once. He eventually proposed a marriage that never took place. Jackson wasn't much interested in art, but he looked up to and relied upon his brother Charles, a serious artist, who eventually introduced Jackson to Thomas Hart Benton. Jackson became Benton's assistant and only then got involved with art. Jackson didn't think like a painter or move paint around like painters do. He didn't enjoy the touch of the brush against the canvas or the thought process that comes with applying paint like de Kooning did. But Jackson did something else, something extraordinary. He put the canvas on the floor and merged his tortured soul with pigment and created a brand new visual language. He fused his pain and agony, encapsulated it into ribbons, streaks, strips, and arabesque ropes of beautiful patterns and colors that made the pain more palatable. Matthias Grunwald paints the ultimate agony in his, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this, Ischenheim altarpiece, but his passion, skill, and artistic genius transcend the pain and create beauty in the process. Jackson's work does the same thing by creating swirling vortexes of raw, unfiltered emotions. Jackson said that artists who painted circles are madmen, like Van Gogh, but Van Gogh heaped up swirls of thick paint to create the moon and starbursts in the starry night.
whereas Pollock's works are a merger of his intestines, heart, and internal organs projected onto the canvas with poured and squirted pigment. He wanted blood, too, and once stepped into broken bits of glass, cut his feet on his painting so his blood could mingle with the pigment. He was a painting shaman, driving himself into altered states, carried away by his own healing process. In 1949, Life magazine sent a reporter to cover the exploding movement. Jackson was posed in front of one of his drip paintings with a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, looking sexy and powerful, but also troubled. It reminded him of the Hollywood advertisements for James Dean movies just before the young actor died in a car wreck. Jackson stared directly at the camera, imitating Dean's tragic look. The caption read, "Jackson Pollock, is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" Who's next? Who's 19?
Number 19, going once, going twice. Number 20.
There you go. Suddenly, everyone.
Suddenly, everyone knew the name Pollock, and the abstract expressionists became famous overnight. Our enclave on 10th Street was invaded. The nature of the group began to change. The insiders were now exposed to the outside. Prices remained modest until museums got involved and set themselves up as arbiters of taste. They decided who was worthy and became a link between the collectors and the galleries. Younger artists were pushed aside and a caste system was set up. Placement in art society interjected itself with strata and entry levels. A few years later, the scene fell apart, fractured by the onslaught of fame. It was as if a missile had landed in our midst and shattered the group. Despite the glamorous appearance of camaraderie, the abstract expressionists worked in isolation. They are linked together in art history texts, but it is important to realize that they worked in totally different ways. Elaine de Kooning and Jackson Pollock couldn't be further apart in technique and style. These artists wandered into the unexplored territory alone in their studios. Only religious artists of the past had permitted such aspirations. Byzantine Gothic and Renaissance artists devoted their lives to exploring the kingdom of God. But no matter how far they ventured into the heavens, they remained grounded on earth. They belonged to guilds and religious orders. The abstract expressionists, however, were isolated individuals who painted themselves into a corner, unable to return to a stabilized life. Jackson was shoved, promoted, and pushed to produce. He hated it. De Kooning suffered a similar fate. At the end of his life, sick and suffering from advanced Alzheimer's, he should have been able to watch the sunset over his beloved Laos Point Bay, listen to the flapping of the seagull's wings, and paint when he wanted. Instead, paintbrushes were shoved into his fingers to produce more art. Making marks on canvas may have given his addled brain a bit of pleasure, but the underlying motives of his friends were elsewhere. When I resisted being pulled into Pollock's spiraling downward vortex and determined to leave the glamorous mythology of abstract expressionism, I paid a heavy price by absenting myself. I hated to leave Jackson alone at the Cedar Bar, but it was 2 in the morning and the streets were nearly deserted. I briskly walked to 21st Street, scared and alone, and headed for my newly rented 5th floor walk-up in Chelsea.
This was not the life for me. That night I vowed never to return to the Cedar Bar. It was also the last time I saw Jackson Pollock alive.
Wow.
Street, Lucky 21. Wow. Pollock's paintings are visions of the universe. He was an astronaut wandering through galaxies, severed from worldly connection. I loved Pollock's work, but I didn't want to wind up a depressed and broken woman. Nor did I need the emotional chaos the abstract expressionists found necessary to create art. I had experienced enough emotional chaos within my own family. I wanted stability. Art was the most important thing in my life, but I wasn't going to let it kill me. These artists produced some of the greatest works of the 20th century, yet they were self-destructive and were overcome by lethal addictions. I could never be mistress, wife, babysitter, promoter, or cook for any of them. I wanted to find another kind of man. A decent man who could be a good father. Already I knew that one day I wanted to have a child. A child I could love with all my heart. A child who would return my love. I was an artist, nothing would stop that. But I would also want a stable, safe environment for my future family, and I believed that I could do it all. As a result of leaving the Cedar Bar and abstract expressionism behind, my work went through a series of changes that led me in a new and more structured direction. Abstract expressionism was my mother, but if you have to leave your mother in order to grow, my work did not come from a reckless place or a broken spirit. What I wanted was order and structure. When I left Jackson at the Cedar Bar, I essentially left abstract expressionism. The old masters intrigued me. I began to copy them and strive to achieve this incredible technique, narrative, and iconography, forever amazed at their magnificent talents. I wondered if any contemporary artist could come near the greatness. I studied an ever-expanding collection, of anatomy and drawing books, from Vesalius to Robert Beverly Hale. The path I took eventually led to the invention of photorealism, but I never completely abandoned abstract expressionism. My photorealist paintings have a titled picture plane and all-over patterns that extend to the edges of the canvas. They are directly informed by ab-ex spatial concepts. There's a new paragraph about the women of abstract expressionism. Do you want me to continue on?
Speaking about those.
Okay. As I grew into young womanhood, the pressure to choose between my panties of my art increased exponentially. It's a good place to end.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you to all of our readers today. It's been wonderful to listen to Audrey's words. A special extra thanks to Helen Harrison for being here. You know, I'm really glad that we made it into that whole intense Pollock section because, of course, you may know, I hope that you know that Helen ran the Pollock Krasner House for years and years with such great dignity, information, infinite patience. On tours with you at the Pollock Krasner House were some of my great pleasures out here. And it's still going strong. She's no longer the director, but you can see for yourself where that mischief maker made mischief. And I also want to thank Kenya's book so much for bringing the book. We covered this little smidge of this book, and there's that much more to go. And I'm not quite finished with it myself. I was going to have spoken to Audrey today, of course, and it was with great shocking sadness that I found out about her death. But I love that we've chosen to use her own words because she was never without something to say. And the stories, the anecdotes, the sense of New York that continues in this book, the richness, her struggles with the art world, and her feminist endeavors. I mean, really, this woman was a fighter her whole life. So I strongly recommend that you read the rest of it because it's very satisfying. It's very, very informative. And I know, Helen, that you were a great person with whom Audrey spoke about this book and consulted. And I know you had an influence on it. So I'm sure she'd be very happy that you're here for that reason alone. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming, and go with Audrey.